Maria Santos had always been different from other girls in her small Arizona town. While her friends spent their afternoons at the mall or painting their nails, Maria could be found at her grandfather's ranch, learning to handle firearms with the precision of a seasoned soldier. Her grandfather, Carlos Santos, was a retired military man who believed that every person should know how to protect themselves and others. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty ground as Maria walked toward the old barn where her grandfather kept his collection of weapons. She had been coming here every day for the past 3 years, ever since she turned 16. Today felt different, though. There was something in the air, a tension that made her skin prickle with anticipation. "Maria, come here," her grandfather called from inside the barn. His voice carried the weight of authority that came from years of commanding soldiers in distant lands. Maria quickened her pace, her boots crunching on the gravel path. Inside the barn, the familiar smell of gun oil and leather filled her nostrils. Sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, illuminating rows of carefully maintained firearms mounted on the walls. Her grandfather stood near a workbench, his weathered hands holding something she had never seen before. "This," he said, lifting a sleek black pistol, "is an Apache. Not the helicopter, mind you, but something far more dangerous in the right hands." The weapon gleamed under the light, its surface reflecting years of careful maintenance and respect. Maria approached slowly, her eyes fixed on the gun. She had handled many firearms over the years, but this one seemed different. There was an elegance to it, a beauty that spoke of both power and precision. Her grandfather had taught her to respect every weapon, to understand that each one had its own personality and purpose. The Apache was designed by French arms manufacturers, her grandfather continued, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher. "It's not just a gun, Maria. It's a piece of history, a work of art that happens to be capable of saving lives or taking them, depending on who holds it." He extended the weapon toward her, grip first, following the safety protocols he had drilled into her head since childhood. Maria reached out with both hands, her movements deliberate and respectful. The moment her fingers wrapped around the grip, she felt something she had never experienced before. It wasn't just the weight of the metal or the cool touch of the steel. There was something else, something that seemed to flow from the weapon into her very being. Her grandfather watched her carefully, noting the change in her expression, the way her breathing became more controlled, more focused. "Do you feel it?" he asked quietly. Maria nodded, unable to find words for what was happening. The Apache felt like an extension of her own body, as if it had been made specifically for her hands. She had always been a good shot, better than most of the boys her age, but this was different. This felt like destiny. "Your grandmother had the same reaction," her grandfather said softly, his eyes growing distant with memory. "She could make that gun sing like a violin in the hands of a master musician. I've never seen anything like it, before or since." Maria looked up at him in surprise. Her grandfather rarely spoke about her grandmother, who had died when Maria was just a baby. What little she knew came from old photographs and brief comments from relatives who seemed reluctant to discuss the past. "She was a remarkable woman," he continued, moving to a chest in the corner of the barn. "Came from a family of law enforcement officers, but she had a gift that went beyond training or practice. She could sense danger before it arrived, could read people like open books." He opened the chest and pulled out a small cloth bag. From inside, he withdrew what looked like a military patch, its colors faded with age. The design showed an eagle in flight, its wings spread wide, with small details embroidered in gold thread. "This was hers," he said, holding the patch carefully. "She wore it on every mission, said it brought her luck. But it was more than luck, Maria. It was a symbol of who she was, what she stood for." Maria set the Apache down carefully on the workbench and took the patch from her grandfather's hands. The fabric was soft with age, but the stitching remained strong. As her fingers traced the outline of the eagle, she felt the same strange sensation she had experienced when holding the gun. "What kind of missions?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her grandfather was quiet for a long moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. "Your grandmother worked for people who needed help when the regular authorities couldn't or wouldn't act. She saved lives, Maria. Lots of them." The pieces of a puzzle Maria hadn't even known existed began falling into place. The way her grandfather had trained her, the intensity of his instruction, the weapons he had access to, none of it had been random. He had been preparing her for something specific. "The patch has power," he continued, his voice taking on an almost mystical quality. "Not magic, mind you, but The kind of power that comes from believing in something greater than yourself. Your grandmother believed it connected her to all the women who had fought for justice before her. Maria felt a chill run down her spine. The morning that had started like any other had suddenly become a moment that would define the rest of her life. She looked at the patch in her hands, then at the Apache on the workbench, and, finally, at her grandfather's serious expression. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because there are people in this world who prey on the innocent," he replied. "People who think they can take whatever they want, hurt whoever they choose, simply because they believe they're stronger or more powerful. Your grandmother understood that sometimes the only way to stop such people is to speak their language." He moved to another section of the barn and returned with a tactical vest, black and fitted with multiple pockets and attachments. "This was hers too," he said, holding it up. "Modified to fit her perfectly, designed to carry everything she might need." Maria reached out and touched the vest, feeling the same electric sensation. It was as if her grandmother's spirit was somehow still connected to these objects, waiting for the right person to claim them. "I don't understand," Maria said, though part of her was beginning to comprehend more than she wanted to admit. 3 months ago, her grandfather began, his voice growing harder. A group of men moved into the area. They call themselves the Desert Wolves, and they've been terrorizing families, kidnapping young women, running drugs through our communities. The authorities know about them, but they can't seem to get enough evidence to shut them down. Maria felt her stomach tighten. She had heard rumors, whispered conversations that stopped when adults noticed her listening. Girls from nearby towns had gone missing, and there were stories of families being threatened, businesses being extorted. "These men think they're untouchable," her grandfather continued. "They have money, connections, lawyers who know how to work the system. But they've made a mistake, Maria. They've started operating too close to home." He walked to the window and looked out across the desert landscape. "Yesterday, they took Rebecca Martinez." Maria's blood ran cold. Rebecca was a girl from her school, just 17 years old, with dreams of becoming a teacher. She was kind and gentle, the type of person who wouldn't hurt a fly. "The police are investigating," her grandfather said. "But investigation takes time, and Rebecca doesn't have time. These animals don't keep their victims alive for long." Maria understood now why this morning felt different. Her grandfather wasn't just sharing family history or teaching her about weapons. He was asking her to make a choice that would change everything. "You want me to help find her," she said, the words coming out as a statement rather than a question. "I want you to understand what you're capable of," he replied. "Your grandmother would never have stood by while innocent people suffered. She would have acted, consequences be damned." Maria picked up the Apache again, feeling its familiar weight in her hands. The weapon seemed to pulse with energy, as if it were alive and eager to be used for its intended purpose. She thought about Rebecca, probably scared and alone somewhere, waiting for help that might never come through official channels. "How do we find her?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear and excitement coursing through her veins. Her grandfather smiled for the first time that morning. "We start by learning everything we can about the Desert Wolves. Their patterns, their hideouts, their weaknesses. Your grandmother always said that information was the most powerful weapon of all." He led her to another part of the barn she had never seen before, concealed behind what looked like a false wall. Inside was a sophisticated communication center, complete with computers, maps, and surveillance equipment. "I've been tracking them for months," he said, pointing to a large map covered with pins and notes. "They operate out of an old mining complex about 40 miles north of here. Isolated, defensible, perfect for their kind of business." Maria studied the map, her mind already working on the tactical problems they would face. Her grandfather had taught her well, and she could see the challenges and opportunities laid out before them. "When do we go?" she asked. "We don't," he said firmly. "This is your choice to make, Maria, but it's also your mission to plan and execute. I'm too old for this kind of work, and my joints aren't what they used to be. But I can provide support, intelligence, backup if things go wrong." The weight of responsibility settled on Maria's shoulders like a heavy cloak. She was being asked to do something that trained professionals had been unable to accomplish. But as she held her grandmother's patch and felt the Apache's familiar grip, she realized that she had been preparing for this moment her entire life. "There's something else," her grandfather said, his expression growing even more serious. "The Desert Wolves aren't just criminals. They're connected to something larger, something that goes beyond drug running and kidnapping. Your grandmother was investigating the same organization when she died. Maria felt the world shift around her. You mean she didn't die in an accident? Her grandfather shook his head slowly. Car accidents can be arranged, Maria. Especially when someone gets too close to powerful people who prefer to remain in the shadows. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Everything she had believed about her family, about her past, about the random nature of tragedy, suddenly took on new meaning. Her grandmother hadn't just been a woman with unusual skills. She had been a warrior in a war most people didn't even know was being fought. They killed her because she was about to expose them, her grandfather continued. But she was careful, and she left behind everything someone would need to finish what she started. He handed her a key, small and silver, worn smooth by years of handling. This opens a safety deposit box in Phoenix. Inside you'll find files, photographs, evidence that could bring down the entire network. But it's dangerous knowledge, Maria. The same people who killed your grandmother would kill you without hesitation if they knew you had it. Maria closed her fingers around the key, feeling its weight as if it contained the destiny of generations. She understood now that this wasn't just about rescuing Rebecca Martinez, though that was certainly important. This was about continuing a fight that her grandmother had started, about standing up to evil in all its forms. I need time to think, she said, though part of her mind was already made up. Of course, her grandfather replied. But don't take too long. Rebecca's time is running out, and every day the desert wolves operate, more innocent people suffer. Maria carefully placed the patch in her pocket and set the Apache back on the workbench. As she walked toward the barn door, her grandfather called after her. Maria, he said softly, your grandmother would be proud of the woman you've become. But she would also want you to understand that once you put on that patch, once you pick up that gun with the intention of using it, there's no going back. You'll be stepping into a world where the rules are different, where survival depends on being faster, smarter, and more determined than your enemies. She paused at the threshold, looking back at the man who had shaped her into who she was. What if I'm not strong enough? What if I fail? Then, you fail fighting for what's right, he said simply. That's all any of us can do. But I don't think you'll fail, Maria. You have her blood, her instincts, her heart. And you have something she never had. You have the knowledge of what happened to her, and the chance to make sure it never happens again. As Maria walked back toward the house, her mind raced with possibilities and plans. The simple life she had known was ending, replaced by something far more complex and dangerous. But with that danger came purpose, a sense of meaning that she had never experienced before. That evening, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Maria fingered the patch in her pocket and thought about the choice before her. She could return the patch and the key to her grandfather, continue with her normal life, and pretend this conversation had never happened. Or she could accept the legacy her grandmother had left behind and step into a world where she could make a real difference. Outside her window, the desert stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars. Somewhere out there, Rebecca Martinez was waiting for rescue. Somewhere out there, the desert wolves were planning their next crime. And somewhere out there, the people responsible for her grandmother's death were continuing their evil work, confident that no one could stop them. As Maria finally drifted off to sleep, she dreamed of eagles soaring over vast landscapes, their wings spread wide against an infinite sky. In her dreams, she could feel the weight of the Apache in her hands and the power of her grandmother's legacy flowing through her veins. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new opportunities to choose between safety and justice. But tonight, for the first time in her life, Maria Santos knew exactly who she was meant to become. The next morning arrived with an urgency that seemed to electrify the very air around Maria's home. She had barely slept, her mind churning with plans and possibilities. As the first rays of sunlight painted the desert sky in shades of orange and pink, she made her decision. The patch felt warm against her skin as she pinned it carefully to her jacket sleeve, its faded eagle design somehow seeming more vivid in the early morning light. Her grandfather was already in the barn when she arrived, sitting at the communications center with multiple screens displaying maps, satellite images, and what appeared to be intercepted radio transmissions. He looked up as she entered, his experienced eyes immediately noting the patch on her sleeve. I was wondering when you'd put that on, he said with a slight smile. Your grandmother wore it in exactly the same place. Maria felt a strange sense of completion, as if she had finally found a piece of herself that had been missing her entire life. The Apache lay on the workbench where she had left it the day before, but now it seemed to be calling to her with an almost magnetic pull. I've been monitoring their communications all night, her grandfather continued, pointing to one of the screens. The desert wolves are more organized than we initially thought. They have scouts, lookouts, and what appears to be a sophisticated early warning system around their compound. Maria moved closer to study the intelligence he had gathered. The mining complex was indeed isolated, situated in a canyon that provided natural defenses on 3 sides. The only practical approach was through a narrow pass that could easily be watched and defended. "How many are we dealing with?" she asked, her voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through her system. "At least 12 men at the main compound," her grandfather replied. "Possibly more. They operate in shifts, with some handling perimeter security while others manage their business operations inside the buildings." He pulled up another screen showing thermal satellite imagery from the previous night. "The good news is that they're confident, maybe overconfident. They're not expecting any serious opposition from law enforcement, and they certainly aren't expecting a single person to attempt a rescue operation." Maria studied the images carefully, her mind automatically analyzing approach routes, potential hiding spots, and escape plans. Years of training were clicking into place like pieces of a complex puzzle. "What about Rebecca? Any indication of where they're holding her?" "The main building has a basement level," her grandfather said, highlighting a section of the compound on the map. "Based on heat signatures and movement patterns, that's where they're likely keeping any prisoners. It's the most secure part of the facility." Maria felt a chill as she imagined what Rebecca might be going through. Every minute that passed was another minute of terror for the kidnapped girl, another moment of uncertainty about whether rescue would come at all. "I need to see the place for myself," Maria said. "Get a feel for the layout, the guards' routines, their weak points." Her grandfather nodded approvingly. "That's exactly what your grandmother would have said. But you can't just drive up there and take a look. They have spotters positioned miles out from the main compound." He moved to another section of the barn and returned with what appeared to be hiking gear, but Maria could see that everything had been modified for tactical use. The backpack had extra compartments, the boots were reinforced with steel plates, and the clothing was designed to provide protection while maintaining mobility. "This is how you get close without being detected," he said, spreading out a topographical map of the area. "There's an old mining trail that winds through the mountains about 5 miles east of their position. It's rough going, but it'll put you on high ground where you can observe without being seen." Maria traced the route with her finger, estimating travel time and identifying potential problems. The trail would require several hours of difficult hiking, but it was doable, especially for someone in her physical condition. "Once I have the intelligence, then what?" she asked. "Then you have choices to make," her grandfather replied seriously. "You could take what you learned to the authorities, hope they can organize a rescue operation, or you could take action yourself." The weight of that decision settled heavily on Maria's shoulders. She understood that her grandfather was offering her the chance to back out, to let others handle the dangerous work. But she also understood that official channels moved slowly, and Rebecca might not have time for proper procedures and bureaucratic processes. "If I go in alone, what are my chances of getting both of us out alive?" Her grandfather was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Your grandmother faced similar odds once," he finally said. "She was outnumbered, outgunned, and operating in hostile territory. But she had 3 advantages that made the difference. Which were: first, she was underestimated. Nobody expected a woman to pose a serious threat, so they weren't prepared for her capabilities. Second, she had superior training and equipment. And third, she was fighting for something more important than her own life." Maria picked up the Apache, feeling its familiar weight in her hands. She had trained with it for hours the previous evening, and already the weapon felt like a natural extension of her body. "There's something else," her grandfather continued, moving to yet another part of the barn. "Your grandmother didn't work alone on her most important missions. She had a network of people who supported her, provided intelligence, watched her back." He revealed a communication device that looked more sophisticated than anything Maria had seen in civilian hands. "This connects you to people who knew your grandmother, who shared her mission. They're still out there, still fighting the same fight." Maria examined the device, noting its military-grade construction and encrypted display. "Who are they?" "Former military, law enforcement, intelligence operatives who got tired of watching evil flourish while good people suffered. Your grandmother helped organize them into something more effective than any of them could be individually. The scope of what she was learning continued to expand beyond anything Maria had imagined. Her grandmother hadn't just been a lone vigilante. She had been part of a larger organization dedicated to fighting injustice wherever they found it. Will they help me rescue Rebecca? They'll provide support, intelligence, backup if necessary, her grandfather said. But the decision about how to proceed will be yours. They respect the independence of their operatives. Maria spent the next several hours studying everything her grandfather had gathered about the desert wolves. She memorized faces, names, patterns of behavior, and tactical assessments of their capabilities. The more she learned, the more she realized that this criminal organization was far more dangerous and well-connected than she had initially understood. As the afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows across the desert, Maria made her preparations for the reconnaissance mission. She dressed in the tactical gear her grandfather had provided, checked and rechecked the Apache and its ammunition, and studied the route she would take through the mountains. Remember, her grandfather said as she prepared to leave, this is just observation. Don't take any unnecessary risks. Get the intelligence we need, then come back so we can plan properly. Maria nodded, though she could feel something stirring inside her that made her wonder if she would be able to simply observe if she saw Rebecca in immediate danger. The patch on her sleeve seemed to pulse with energy, reminding her of the legacy she had accepted. The hike through the mountains proved to be as challenging as anticipated. The trail was barely visible in places, and the terrain was rough enough that Maria had to watch every step to avoid injury. But her training served her well, and she made good time despite the difficult conditions. As the sun began to set, she reached the observation point her grandfather had identified. Using high-powered binoculars, she had a clear view of the desert wolves' compound spread out in the valley below. What she saw made her blood run cold. The facility was larger and more sophisticated than the satellite images had suggested. There were at least 20 buildings, multiple guard towers, and what appeared to be a motor pool with various vehicles, including several that looked military in nature. This wasn't just a criminal hideout. It was a fortified base of operations. Maria spent hours watching the compound, taking notes on guard rotations, vehicle movements, and the general layout of the facility. She counted at least 18 men, all armed, all moving with the discipline of trained soldiers rather than common criminals. Around midnight, she saw something that made her decision for her. A group of men emerged from the main building, dragging a young woman between them. Even at this distance, Maria could see that the victim was fighting, trying to resist, before disappearing into another building. The sight of someone else's suffering, someone else's terror, ignited something fierce inside Maria. This wasn't just about Rebecca anymore. There were other victims, other innocent people being brutalized by these animals. Every instinct her grandfather had trained into her screamed that waiting for official help would mean more suffering, more victims, more evil prospering, while good people hesitated. She activated the communication device her grandfather had given her, and, after a few moments, a voice responded. "Identify yourself," came the prompt, professional response. "My name is Maria Santos," she said quietly. "I'm Elena Santos' granddaughter." There was a pause. Then, a different voice came on the line. "Maria, we've been waiting to hear from you. Your grandfather told us about your inheritance. What's your situation?" Maria quickly briefed them on what she had observed, the number of hostiles, the layout of the compound, and her assessment of the tactical challenges involved in a rescue operation. "That's a significant target," the voice responded. "Too big for a solo operation. We can have a team to your position in 6 hours." "Rebecca Martinez may not have 6 hours," Maria replied. "And I just saw them move another victim. How many more people are they going to hurt while we wait for the perfect moment?" Another pause, then Elena would have said the same thing. "What do you need?" Maria felt a surge of pride and determination. These people had known her grandmother, had fought alongside her, and they understood the urgency of the situation. "Distraction," she said. "Something to draw their attention while I get inside. And extraction support once I have the hostages." "We can provide both," came the reply. "There's a supply truck scheduled to arrive at the compound at 0300 hours. We can arrange for it to have mechanical problems about 2 miles out, which should draw some of their security forces to investigate." Maria checked her watch. It was already past midnight, which gave her less than 3 hours to get into position and prepare for her assault on the compound. "What about after I get the hostages out? There's an old airstrip about 10 miles south of your position. We'll have air support standing by for extraction." "But, Maria, You need to understand. Once you do this, there's no going back. You'll be committed to this life, this fight. Are you sure you're ready? Maria looked down at the compound, thinking about Rebecca and the other victims, thinking about her grandmother's unfinished mission, thinking about all the innocent people who would suffer if someone didn't take action. I'm ready, she said. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of careful planning and preparation. Maria used the intelligence network her grandmother had left behind to get detailed information about the compound's interior layout, security systems, and the most likely locations where prisoners would be held. She learned that the basement of the main building had been converted into a series of cells, and that the desert wolves had been using the facility to hold kidnapping victims while arranging ransom payments, or worse. The knowledge that Rebecca and others were being held in such conditions only strengthened her resolve. As 3 a.m. approached, Maria made her way down from the observation point toward the compound. She moved carefully through the darkness, using every bit of cover the terrain provided. Her black tactical gear made her nearly invisible against the desert landscape, and years of training had taught her how to move silently, even over rough ground. The distraction worked perfectly. At exactly 3:05 a.m., she heard radio chatter from the compound as guards were dispatched to investigate the stranded supply truck. Through her binoculars, she watched as 2 vehicles and at least 6 men left the facility, reducing the security force by nearly a third. This was her moment. Maria checked the Apache one final time, said a silent prayer to her grandmother's memory, and began her approach to the compound. As she moved through the shadows toward the main building, she felt the patch on her sleeve and drew strength from the knowledge that she was continuing a fight that had begun long before her birth. The real test of everything she had learned, everything she had inherited, was about to begin. But Maria Santos was no longer the small-town girl who had walked into her grandfather's barn just 2 days earlier. She was something new, something dangerous, something her enemies would never see coming. The Apache felt alive in her hands as she approached her destiny. The compound's perimeter fence was 8 feet of chain link topped with razor wire. But Maria had studied the layout carefully during her hours of observation. There was a drainage culvert that ran under the fence on the eastern side, probably an oversight by whoever had designed the security system. It was barely large enough for a person to crawl through, but it would get her inside without triggering any alarms. Maria approached the culvert on her belly, moving slowly to avoid making any noise that might alert the remaining guards. The metal pipe was corroded and sharp in places, and she had to control her breathing carefully to avoid making noise as she worked her way through. The Apache remained secure against her back, and she could feel her grandmother's patch pressed against her shoulder as she crawled through the darkness. Once inside the compound, Maria found herself in a different world. Up close, the buildings were larger and more fortified than they had appeared from her mountain observation post. Security cameras were positioned at regular intervals, and she could see that the facility had been designed by someone with military expertise. This wasn't the work of common criminals. This was a professional operation with serious backing. She remained in the shadows for several minutes, observing the movement patterns of the guards who had stayed behind. There were 2 men patrolling the perimeter, walking in opposite directions so that they passed each other every 12 minutes. Another guard was stationed in a tower overlooking the main entrance, and she could see light coming from what appeared to be a command center in a separate building. The main building where the prisoners were being held was about 50 yards from her current position. Getting there would require crossing open ground, but Maria had timed the patrol routes and knew she would have a window of approximately 3 minutes when that section of the compound would be unwatched. As she waited for the right moment, Maria activated her communications device and whispered a brief update to her support team. "I'm inside the perimeter. Moving to primary target now." "Copy that," came the immediate response. "Be advised, we have intelligence that they're planning to move the prisoners tomorrow morning. You're operating on a very tight timeline." The news added urgency to an already dangerous situation. Maria checked her watch and saw that it was now 3:20 a.m. She had maybe 4 hours before dawn, when the compound would become much more active and her chances of success would decrease significantly. When the guards' patrol routes created her window of opportunity, Maria moved. She crossed the open ground at a low run, staying in the shadows cast by the building's exterior lighting. The main building had several entrances, but her intelligence indicated that the basement access was through a service door on the north side. The door was locked, but Maria had come prepared. Her grandfather had taught her lock-picking as part of her training, though she had never imagined she would need the skill for a mission like this. Working by feel in the darkness, she had the lock open in less than 2 minutes. The interior of the building was dimly lit by emergency lighting, casting long shadows down corridors that led deeper into the facility. Maria could hear voices coming from somewhere on the ground floor, but they sounded relaxed, not alert. The distraction of the stranded supply truck was still working in her favor. Finding the basement access required careful exploration. The building was larger than it appeared from outside, with multiple corridors and rooms that seemed to serve various purposes. Some appeared to be living quarters, others looked like offices or planning rooms. Maria photographed what she could with a small camera, knowing that the intelligence would be valuable for future operations against this organization. The basement stairs were behind a heavy metal door marked with warning signs in Spanish and English. As Maria descended into the lower level, the temperature dropped noticeably, and she could detect the unmistakable smell of fear and confinement. Her anger at the people responsible for this place grew stronger with each step down. The basement had been converted into a prison with 6 cells, each secured with heavy steel doors and electronic locks. Maria could hear movement from behind several of the doors, and muffled voices that suggested multiple people were being held captive. She approached the first cell and found a small window that allowed her to look inside. A young woman was huddled in the corner, and Maria's heart raced as she recognized Rebecca Martinez. The girl looked terrified but unharmed, and Maria felt a surge of relief that she had arrived in time. The other cells contained additional prisoners, 3 more young women and 2 men who appeared to be older. All looked like they had been held for some time, and Maria realized that the Desert Wolves operation was larger and more systematic than anyone had imagined. The electronic locks were sophisticated, but Maria's support team had provided her with a universal override device. As she worked to open Rebecca's cell, she spoke quietly to avoid startling the frightened girl. "Rebecca, my name is Maria. I'm here to get you out. We don't have much time, so I need you to stay calm and do exactly what I tell you." Rebecca's eyes widened with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "How did you find me? Are the police here?" "It's just me," Maria said as the lock clicked open. "But I have backup waiting outside the compound. We're going to get all of you out of here." As she worked to free the other prisoners, Maria explained the situation quickly and quietly. They would need to move together, stay silent, and follow her instructions exactly if they wanted to survive the next hour. The oldest of the male prisoners, a man in his 40s who identified himself as Dr. James Crawford, was weak but coherent. "They took me 3 weeks ago," he whispered. "I was treating some of their injured men, and I learned too much about their operation. They've been using me as their personal physician while they decide what to do with me." Maria realized that Dr. Crawford might have valuable intelligence about the organization's structure and activities. "Can you move?" she asked. "I can move," he replied with determination. "These animals killed my nurse when she tried to escape. I'm not leaving anyone else behind." With all 6 prisoners freed, Maria faced the challenge of getting them out of the building and to the extraction point without being detected. 6 frightened civilians would be difficult to move quietly, especially across the open ground between buildings. She activated her communication device again. "I have 6 packages ready for pickup. Need enhanced distraction in 5 minutes." "Copy that," came the reply. "Stand by for fireworks." Maria led the group up from the basement, positioning them near the exit she had used to enter the building. She explained the route they would take and emphasized the importance of staying together and staying quiet. "When I give the signal, we move fast," she told them. "Don't look back. Don't stop for anything. If someone falls behind, keep going. I'll handle any problems that come up." At exactly 3:45 a.m., explosions erupted from the direction of the motor pool. Maria's support team had arranged for a series of diversions that sent flames shooting into the night sky and triggered alarms throughout the compound. Guards ran toward the disturbance, shouting orders and trying to determine what was happening. "Now," Maria said, and led her group out into the night. Moving 6 people across hostile territory proved to be even more challenging than Maria had anticipated. Rebecca and the other kidnapping victims were weak from their captivity, and Dr. Crawford was struggling despite his determination to escape. Maria found herself half-carrying one of the younger women while constantly scanning for threats. They were halfway to the perimeter fence when things went wrong. A guard who had been responding to the explosions spotted their movement and shouted an alarm. Within seconds, floodlights illuminated the area around them, and Maria could hear more guards running in their direction. "Get to the fence," Maria ordered the civilians. "There's a drainage pipe on the eastern side. Crawl through and keep running toward the mountains." "What about you?" Rebecca asked, her voice filled with fear. "I'll be right behind you," Maria lied, knowing that someone would have to delay the guards long enough for the prisoners to escape. As the civilians stumbled toward the fence, Maria took cover behind a maintenance shed and drew the Apache for the first time since entering the compound. The weapon felt solid and reassuring in her hands, and she could almost feel her grandmother's presence guiding her actions. The first guard to come around the corner never knew what hit him. Maria's shot was clean and precise, dropping the man before he could raise his own weapon. The sound of gunfire echoed across the compound, and she knew that stealth was no longer an option. Two more guards appeared, moving cautiously now that they knew they were facing armed resistance. Maria used her position behind the shed to advantage, forcing them to expose themselves to get clear shots. Her grandfather's training had been thorough, and she found herself thinking tactically, using cover and angles rather than simply trying to outshoot her opponents. The firefight lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours. Maria's ammunition was limited, and she had to make every shot count. The Apache performed flawlessly, its precision and reliability everything her grandfather had promised. But she was outnumbered, and more guards were approaching from other directions. As she reloaded for what might be the final time, Maria heard something that made her heart soar. The distinctive sound of helicopter rotors was approaching from the south, growing louder by the second. "Air support is inbound," came the voice through her communication device. "Mark your position." Maria activated a small infrared beacon and dove for cover as the helicopter swept over the compound. The aircraft opened fire with automatic weapons, forcing the guards to seek shelter and giving Maria the opportunity she needed to reach the fence. Her extraction team had kept their word. As she crawled through the drainage pipe, she could hear the helicopter providing covering fire while the rescued prisoners made their way up the mountain trail towards safety. The hike to the extraction point was a blur of adrenaline and exhaustion. Maria found herself supported by two members of her grandmother's network who had appeared seemingly from nowhere to help get everyone to safety. Rebecca and the other victims were loaded onto a medical helicopter that would take them to a secure hospital, while Dr. Crawford was taken to a separate location where intelligence specialists could debrief him about what he had learned during his captivity. As the sun began to rise over the desert, Maria stood at the extraction point and watched the last helicopter disappear into the morning sky. She had done it. Against overwhelming odds, she had rescued 6 innocent people and struck a significant blow against the Desert Wolves operation. But even as she savored the success of her first mission, Maria knew that this was only the beginning. Dr. Crawford had confirmed that the Desert Wolves were indeed connected to a larger criminal network, one that stretched across multiple states and possibly international borders. The same organization that had killed her grandmother was still operating, still causing suffering, still profiting from human misery. Her grandfather was waiting for her at the extraction point, his face showing a mixture of pride and concern. "Your grandmother would have been proud," he said as he embraced her. "You did something tonight that experienced operators would have considered impossible." "It was just the first step," Maria replied, feeling the weight of her grandmother's patch against her shoulder. "This organization has been operating for years, destroying lives, corrupting officials, spreading their poison throughout our communities. Tonight we saved 6 people, but how many more are out there?" "Many more," her grandfather admitted. "But now you understand what your grandmother understood. Sometimes the only way to fight evil is to speak its language, to be willing to do what others cannot or will not do." As they drove away from the extraction point, Maria thought about the choice she had made just 3 days earlier. The simple life she had known was gone forever, replaced by something far more complex and dangerous. But with that danger came purpose, a sense of meaning that made all the risks worthwhile. The Apache rested securely in its holster, still warm from the night's action. The patch on her sleeve seemed to glow in the morning sunlight, connecting her to a legacy of courage and justice that stretched back generations. Maria Santos was no longer just a young woman from a small Arizona town. She was something new, something her enemies would learn to fear. And this was only the beginning of her war against those who preyed on the innocent. The Desert Wolves would regroup, rebuild, and probably seek revenge. But they would find that their actions had awakened something they were not prepared to face. a new guardian carrying forward an old fight, armed with both ancient wisdom and modern weapons, guided by the spirit of all those who had fought for justice before her. The patch on her sleeve had indeed changed everything. The safe house was located in a remote area outside Phoenix, hidden among rolling hills and desert scrub that made surveillance difficult for unwanted visitors. Maria arrived there 2 days after the successful rescue operation, her body still carrying the aches and pains of her first real mission. The Apache remained at her side, no longer feeling foreign in her hands, but rather like a natural extension of her will. Inside the modest ranch-style building, she found herself face to face with people who had known her grandmother personally. They were older now, bearing the scars and weathered features that came from years of dangerous work, but their eyes still held the sharp intelligence and determination that had made them effective operatives. "Elena would have been amazed to see what you accomplished," said Catherine Walsh, a former CIA operative who had worked alongside Maria's grandmother on several missions. That compound was supposed to be impregnable. The desert wolves had been using it for over 2 years without any successful law enforcement penetration. Maria studied the woman across the table, noting the way Catherine's eyes constantly scanned the room, the way her hands remained positioned for quick access to concealed weapons. This was someone who had lived in the shadow world for decades, someone who understood the true cost of fighting organized evil. "Dr. Crawford's debriefing has provided us with intelligence we've been seeking for years," continued David Kim, a former Army Ranger whose Korean ancestry had made him useful for operations in Asia. The Desert Wolves weren't just a regional criminal organization. They were a franchisee, if you will, of something much larger. The scope of what Maria was learning continued to expand beyond her comprehension. On a large table in the center of the room, maps and photographs were arranged in patterns that revealed connections spanning multiple continents. Red lines connected cities, faces, and organizations in a web of corruption and violence that seemed to touch every aspect of society. "The organization your grandmother was investigating calls itself the Syndicate," Catherine explained, pointing to a photograph of a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit. "They operate like a multinational corporation, with regional managers, territorial divisions, and specialized departments for different types of criminal activity." Maria studied the photograph, memorizing the face of someone who might have been responsible for her grandmother's death. "Who is he?" "Marcus Volkov," David replied. "Russian-born, American-educated, with connections to intelligence services, criminal organizations, and legitimate businesses across the globe. He's essentially the chief operating officer of the largest criminal enterprise in history." The revelation that her grandmother had been fighting something this massive and well-organized made Maria's successful rescue mission seem small by comparison. She had thought she was taking on a local criminal gang, but, in reality, she had struck at just one tentacle of a massive octopus. "Your grandmother got close to exposing their entire western United States operation," Catherine continued. "She had gathered evidence of money laundering, human trafficking, political corruption, and murder for hire that would have sent dozens of their people to prison and disrupted billions of dollars in illegal profits." Maria felt a chill as she realized how dangerous her grandmother's work had been. How close did she get? She had arranged a meeting with a federal prosecutor who specialized in organized crime cases, David said. Someone she trusted, someone who had successfully taken down criminal organizations before. She was supposed to turn over all her evidence the morning after she died. The room fell silent as the implications settled over everyone present. Maria's grandmother had been within hours of potentially bringing down a massive criminal empire when her life was cut short. "The evidence was never found," Catherine added quietly. The prosecutor assumed she had been mistaken about having sufficient proof. The investigation stalled, and the syndicate continued operating. Maria thought about the key her grandfather had given her, the one that opened a safety deposit box in Phoenix. What if the evidence wasn't lost? What if she hid it somewhere safe? Both Catherine and David leaned forward with sudden interest. "Do you know something about hidden evidence?" David asked. Maria retrieved the key from her pocket and placed it on the table. "My grandfather gave me this. He said it opens a safety deposit box with information that could bring down the entire network." Catherine picked up the key and examined it carefully. "This is from First National Bank in Phoenix, their high-security facility downtown." She looked back at Maria with growing excitement. "If your grandmother really did hide evidence there, and if it's still intact after all these years, then we might finally have the weapon we need to fight back," David finished. Over the next several hours, Maria learned more about the organization she had inherited from her grandmother. It wasn't large, maybe 50 people scattered across the country, but they were all highly skilled and completely dedicated to fighting corruption and organized crime wherever they found it. They called themselves the Guardians, and they had been operating for over 20 years, taking on cases that official law enforcement couldn't or wouldn't handle. Some were former military, others had backgrounds in intelligence or law enforcement. All had reached a point where they were no longer willing to watch evil prosper while good people suffered. "We don't take orders from any government," Catherine explained. "We don't report to any agency or bureaucracy. We answer only to our own conscience and our commitment to justice. It makes us more flexible than official operators, but it also makes us more vulnerable." Maria understood the trade-off. The Guardians could act quickly and decisively, but they also operated without the legal protections and institutional support that came with government sanction. They were walking a narrow line between justice and vigilantism, and any mistake could destroy them. "What's our next move?" she asked. "We retrieve whatever your grandmother left in that safety deposit box," David said. "But we have to assume the syndicate is watching for any activity related to Elena's work. Going to that bank will be dangerous." Catherine spread out a map of Phoenix, highlighting routes, potential surveillance points, and escape plans. They've had years to position people, to corrupt bank employees, to set up monitoring systems. We have to assume they're prepared for someone to eventually come looking for Elena's evidence. Maria studied the tactical challenge before them. The bank was located in downtown Phoenix, surrounded by busy streets and tall buildings that could conceal watchers. Getting in and out without being detected would require careful planning and perfect execution. "I should go alone," she said finally. "They're looking for guardians, for people who match the profile of my grandmother's associates. They're not looking for a young woman who might just be conducting normal banking business." "Absolutely not," David said firmly. "You're too valuable to risk on what might be a trap." "With respect," Maria replied, her voice carrying a new authority that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. "My grandmother's evidence is the key to everything we're fighting for. If there's a chance to retrieve it, we have to take that chance." Catherine studied Maria carefully, noting the determination in her eyes, the way she carried herself with new confidence. "You're not the same person who walked into that compound 3 days ago." "No, I'm not," Maria agreed. 3 days ago, I was someone who had inherited weapons and equipment. Now I'm someone who has inherited a mission." The transformation was obvious to everyone present. The young woman who had needed guidance and support for her first operation was becoming someone capable of making her own tactical decisions. The patch on her sleeve seemed to glow with significance as she outlined her plan for retrieving her grandmother's evidence. "I go in as myself, a granddaughter settling estate business," she said. "Normal clothes, normal behavior, nothing that would trigger surveillance protocols. But I carry the Apache concealed, and I have backup positioned at multiple points around the bank." David and Catherine exchanged glances, recognizing the sound tactical thinking behind Maria's proposal. "What about extraction if things go wrong?" "Multiple exit routes, multiple backup plans," Maria replied without hesitation. "And if the evidence is compromised or if it's clearly a trap, I abort the mission and we find another way to fight them." As they refined the plan over the next several hours, Maria felt the weight of her grandmother's legacy settling more firmly on her shoulders. This wasn't just about rescuing kidnapping victims anymore. This was about taking on a criminal empire that had been operating with impunity for decades. The Apache would be concealed in a shoulder holster beneath a business jacket. She would wear normal civilian clothes and carry a briefcase that contained emergency equipment hidden in false compartments. To any observer, she would appear to be exactly what she was pretending to be, a young woman conducting routine business. "The safety deposit box area is on the lower level," Catherine explained, showing Maria blueprints of the bank's interior. "High security, limited access, multiple cameras. If they have people inside the bank, that's where they'll be positioned." "What about bank employees?" Maria asked. "How do we know who we can trust?" "We don't," David said bluntly. "We have to assume that anyone could be compromised. You get in, retrieve whatever's in that box, and get out as quickly as possible." As the sun set over the Arizona desert, Maria prepared for what might be the most important mission of her life. The evidence her grandmother had died protecting could be the key to bringing down a criminal organization responsible for countless deaths and immeasurable suffering. But as she checked the Apache one final time and adjusted the patch on her sleeve, Maria understood that she was also walking into what could be a carefully prepared trap. The syndicate had had years to prepare for this moment, and they would not hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatened their operations. The weight of her grandmother's legacy pressed against her as she realized that tomorrow might determine not just her own fate, but the fate of everyone who had been fighting this war in the shadows. Success could mean the beginning of the end for one of the world's most powerful criminal organizations. Failure could mean the end of the Guardians and the continuation of evil on a massive scale. As night fell over the safe house, Maria Santos prepared to claim her inheritance not just of weapons and equipment, but of a mission that had cost her grandmother's life. The patch on her sleeve caught the lamplight as she made her final preparations, its faded eagle design seeming to spread its wings in preparation for flight. Tomorrow would test everything she had learned, everything she had inherited, and everything she had become. The Apache at her side would be more than just a weapon. It would be a symbol of justice seeking its target after years of patience. The transformation that had begun in her grandfather's barn just days earlier was nearly complete. Maria Santos was becoming someone her enemies would learn to fear, someone carrying forward a fight that had begun before her birth and would continue long after she was gone. The syndicate had killed her grandmother, but they had also created their own worst nightmare. A new guardian who understood exactly what she was fighting against and exactly what she was willing to sacrifice to win. The eagle on her patch seemed poised for flight as Maria prepared for the most dangerous day of her life. The morning of the bank operation dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crisp Arizona air that made everything seem sharper and more focused. Maria stood before the mirror in her safe house room, adjusting the business jacket that concealed the Apache in its shoulder holster. The weapon's presence was reassuring, a constant reminder of the power she now carried and the responsibility that came with it. The patch on her sleeve was hidden beneath the jacket's fabric, but she could feel its presence against her skin like a living thing. Every breath seemed to strengthen the connection between her and the legacy she had inherited, the mission that had consumed her grandmother's life and now defined her own. Catherine and David had positioned themselves at strategic points around the downtown Phoenix area, ready to provide support if the operation went wrong. But Maria would be going into the bank alone, relying on her own skills and instincts to retrieve whatever evidence her grandmother had hidden there 20 years earlier. The First National Bank building was a gleaming tower of glass and steel that dominated several city blocks. As Maria approached the main entrance, she forced herself to walk at a normal pace, to breathe normally, to project the image of someone conducting routine business rather than someone about to attempt one of the most dangerous missions of her life. Inside, the bank's lobby was spacious and modern, with marble floors that reflected the morning sunlight streaming through tall windows. Maria approached the information desk with confidence, presenting the key and identification documents that would allow her access to her grandmother's safety deposit box. "I need to access box number 2847, she told the clerk, a middle-aged woman whose professional smile seemed genuine enough. "I'm handling estate business for my grandmother." The clerk examined the documentation carefully, entering information into her computer system. Maria watched the woman's face for any sign of recognition or alarm, any indication that her presence had triggered some kind of alert system. "Everything appears to be in order," the clerk said finally. "I'll need you to sign here, and then I'll escort you down to the vault level." The elevator ride to the basement felt longer than it probably was, with Maria's heightened awareness making every second stretch like an hour. The Apache pressed reassuringly against her ribs, and she could feel the outline of the emergency equipment hidden in her briefcase. The vault level was exactly as Catherine had described. High security, limited access, cameras positioned to cover every angle. Maria noted the positions of the security cameras and the location of emergency exits as she followed the clerk through multiple checkpoints. "The safety deposit boxes are through here," the clerk explained, leading Maria into a secure area lined with hundreds of metal boxes. "You'll have privacy for as long as you need to examine the contents." Left alone with box 2847, Maria inserted the key with hands that remained perfectly steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. The lock turned smoothly, and she pulled out a metal container that was heavier than she had expected. Inside the container, she found exactly what her grandfather had promised, evidence that could bring down a criminal empire. There were photographs, financial records, recorded conversations, and what appeared to be a detailed organizational chart showing the structure of the syndicate from top to bottom. But there was something else, something that made Maria's heart race with excitement and fear. At the bottom of the container was a notebook written in her grandmother's careful handwriting, documenting not just the syndicate's crimes, but their plans for expansion, their methods of corruption, and, most importantly, the identities of their key operatives. As Maria quickly photographed each document with a hidden camera, she realized that her grandmother had assembled enough evidence to destroy the syndicate completely. Names, dates, locations, financial transactions, everything a prosecutor would need to bring down dozens of criminals and seize billions of dollars in illegal assets. She was so focused on documenting the evidence that she almost missed the soft sound of footsteps in the corridor outside. Almost, but her grandfather's training and her own developing instincts warned her that something was wrong. Through the partially open door, she could see two men in expensive suits moving with the kind of deliberate purpose that suggested they were not ordinary bank customers. Both men were scanning the area systematically, and Maria caught a glimpse of shoulder holsters beneath their jackets. The syndicate had found her. Maria quickly placed all the documents back in the container and closed the safety deposit box. She needed to get out of the bank immediately, but the men outside were positioned between her and the main exit route. Her backup plans would have to suffice. She activated a small emergency transmitter that would alert Catherine and David to the situation, then moved toward the service corridor that bank employees used to access the vault area. Her briefcase contained lockpicks and other equipment that would allow her to bypass security doors, but using them would require precious time she might not have. The sound of voices in the main corridor told her that the two men had been joined by others. They were conducting some kind of search, moving methodically through the safety deposit box area. Maria realized that they weren't just looking for her. They were looking for her grandmother's evidence. Moving through the service corridors required navigating a maze of narrow hallways and maintenance areas. Maria's business clothes were not designed for this kind of movement, but she managed to make her way toward what she hoped was an emergency exit. She had almost reached the exit when she heard voices behind her. The men had figured out her route and were following her through the service areas. Maria quickened her pace, knowing that once she was outside the bank, Catherine and David would be able to provide cover and assistance. The emergency exit opened onto an alley behind the bank, and Maria immediately felt exposed as she emerged into the bright morning sunlight. But her backup plan was working. She could see David positioned on a rooftop across the street, and she knew Catherine was somewhere nearby with transportation. That's when the first shot rang out. The bullet struck the wall near Maria's head, sending concrete chips flying and confirming that the men pursuing her were willing to use lethal force in broad daylight. Maria drew the Apache in one smooth motion, feeling the familiar weight of the weapon as she took cover behind a dumpster. Two men emerged from the emergency exit behind her, both armed with pistols and moving with military precision. These were not street criminals. These were professional operators with training that matched her own. Maria's first shot was clean and precise, dropping the lead man before he could establish a firing position. The Apache performed exactly as her grandfather had promised, its accuracy and reliability giving her the edge she needed in a close-quarters firefight. The second man was more cautious, using the doorframe as cover while returning fire. Maria could hear sirens in the distance, which meant that someone had called the police. The situation was escalating beyond anything she had planned for. That's when David's support made the difference. A sniper shot from the rooftop across the street eliminated the second pursuer, giving Maria the opportunity she needed to reach the extraction point where Catherine was waiting with a motorcycle. "Go, go, go!" Catherine shouted as Maria swung onto the back of the bike. They accelerated out of the alley just as police cars began arriving at the bank, their sirens wailing and lights flashing. The ride through Phoenix traffic was a blur of high-speed maneuvering and evasive tactics. Catherine knew the city well and used her knowledge to stay ahead of any pursuit while making their way to a secondary safe house across town. Only when they were safely inside the new location did Maria allow herself to process what had just happened. She had successfully retrieved her grandmother's evidence, but the syndicate's response confirmed that they were willing to kill to protect their secrets. "They were waiting for us," David said when he arrived at the safe house an hour later. "Someone knew we were coming." Maria felt a chill as the implications became clear. Either the syndicate had been monitoring the safety deposit box for 20 years, or someone within the Guardians had betrayed them. It doesn't matter now, Catherine said pragmatically. What matters is that we have the evidence. The question is what we do with it. Maria spread out the photographs she had taken, showing her fellow guardians the scope of what her grandmother had discovered. The evidence was even more comprehensive than they had hoped, a complete blueprint for destroying the syndicate's operations throughout the western United States. We can't just turn this over to the authorities, David pointed out. The syndicate has been operating for decades because they have people inside law enforcement, inside the justice system. We need someone we can absolutely trust. Maria studied the notebook her grandmother had written, noting the careful way she had documented not just crimes but also the methods used to cover them up. One name appeared repeatedly in the margins: Judge Patricia Morrison, Federal District Court. My grandmother trusted Judge Morrison, Maria said, pointing to the repeated references. She was planning to present all this evidence to her. Catherine looked up the judge's record on a laptop computer. She's still on the bench, still handling organized crime cases. And she has a reputation for being completely incorruptible. Then, that's our answer, Maria said with decision. We finish what my grandmother started. We get this evidence to Judge Morrison and let the legal system do its job. But, even as they planned their approach to the judge, Maria knew that the syndicate would not give up easily. They had killed her grandmother to protect their secrets, and they would certainly try to kill her to prevent those secrets from coming to light. Over the next 2 days, the Guardians used their network to arrange a secure meeting with Judge Morrison. The judge, now in her 70s, remembered Maria's grandmother well and was shocked to learn that Elena Santos had been murdered for her investigation rather than dying in an accident. Elena was the most thorough investigator I ever worked with, Judge Morrison said as she examined the evidence Maria had retrieved. This is exactly the kind of comprehensive case she would have built. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showed millions of dollars flowing through shell companies. Recorded conversations implicated dozens of criminals and corrupt officials, and the organizational charts revealed the syndicate structure in unprecedented detail. I can have federal indictments prepared within a week, the judge promised. But you need to understand that once this process begins, you'll all be targets. The syndicate won't just roll over and accept defeat. Maria understood the risks, but she also understood the opportunity. For the first time in decades, they had the chance to strike a devastating blow against organized evil. The patch on her sleeve seemed to pulse with energy as she made her decision. My grandmother died fighting these people, she said. I'm not going to let her sacrifice be meaningless. 6 months later, the largest organized crime prosecution in American history resulted in the conviction of 47 defendants and the seizure of over $3 billion in criminal assets. The syndicate's Western operations were completely dismantled, and their influence in law enforcement and politics was exposed and eliminated. Marcus Volkov, the man Maria had seen in the photograph, was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. As he was led away in chains, he looked directly at Maria, who was sitting in the courtroom gallery wearing her grandmother's patch openly for the first time. The Guardians continued their work, taking on cases that official law enforcement couldn't handle, fighting corruption and organized crime wherever they found it. Maria became one of their most effective operatives, carrying forward the mission her grandmother had started. The Apache remained at her side, no longer feeling foreign but rather like a natural extension of her will and purpose. The patch on her sleeve had indeed changed everything, transforming a young woman from a small Arizona town into a guardian of justice for people who had no other protection. Years passed, and Maria's reputation grew. Criminals learned to fear the woman with the faded eagle patch who could appear without warning and disappear just as quickly. She became a legend in the shadow world, someone who carried forward an ancient fight between good and evil. But she never forgot that it had all begun with a simple moment in her grandfather's barn, when she had first touched an Apache pistol and felt the weight of destiny in her hands. The patch on her sleeve had connected her to something larger than herself, something that would continue long after she was gone. The eagle spread its wings against the desert sky, carrying justice on swift wings to those who thought they were beyond the reach of consequence. Maria Santos had become exactly what her grandmother had been, a guardian standing between the innocent and those who would prey upon them. The transformation was complete, but the mission would never end. As long as evil existed in the world, there would be guardians to stand against it, carrying forward the legacy of all those who had fought for justice before them. The patch on her sleeve was no longer just a symbol of the past. It had become a promise for the future.